Hey viewers and viewers, I'm General Red Strategist and welcome back to some more Danganronpa discussion content. Now, quite some time ago, me and my friend Phil actually did a Q&A video where I was asked a Danganronpa themed question. The question was, what would I like to see in a future Danganronpa game / installment? This was a very interesting topic, and I'll admit it's a topic I have sometimes thought about ever since completing Danganronpa V3 many months ago. Now, I did give a few ideas in that aforementioned Q&A video, but for a while I've been thinking about actually collating the broad mass of these ideas and putting them together into a video on the subject. So here we are, ladies and gents, my list of 5 things I'd like to see in a hypothetical future Danganronpa game. This covers all kinds of things, from ideas about settings, to characters, to chapter patterns, a whole mix of stuff basically. Now, before we get to the list, I will say this. Some of the ideas I'm about to outline will contain some spoilers for elements of the official Danganronpa games, as well as other installments in the franchise. So if you don't want certain details being spoiled, I recommend that you navigate away from this video right now. However, if you've already played all the games and / or are not bothered by spoilers, then we'll plough forward. So, in no particular order, let's go through some of the things I'd like to see. Number 1. Shaking up the chapter tropes. Okay, allow me to explain what I mean by this. If you've played the 3 main Danganronpa games, so Trigger Happy Havoc, Goodbye Despair, V3, you'll probably have noticed that there are certain commonalities across all 3 games in terms of how the chapters, and their respective murder cases in particular, play out. For instance, example A, in every chapter 2 there's always a big reveal about at least one character's identity. So in Trigger Happy Havoc it was Toko Fukawa being revealed as Genocide Jack, and then Chihiro Fujisaki being revealed to be a boy. In Goodbye Despair it was Peko Pekoyama being revealed to be Fuyuhiko Kuzuryu's bodyguard. Then in V3 it was Kurumi Tojo's governmental connection, followed by Maki Harukawa being outed as an assassin. Example B, in every chapter 3 there is always a double murder case. So in Trigger Happy Havoc it was the deaths of Hifumi Yamada and Kiyotaka Ishimaru. In Goodbye Despair it was Ibuki Miyoja and Hiyoko Saionji. Then in V3 it was Anji Onaga and Tenko Chabashira. Example C, each of the 3 main Danganronpa games features a buff character, and it seems to be tradition that the buff character always dies in chapter 4. So in Trigger Happy Havoc we saw the death of Sakura Ogami, in Goodbye Despair it was Nekomaru Nidai, and in V3 it was Gonta Gokuhara. Example D, every chapter 5 murder case always involves an attempt to break or manipulate the killing game itself in some way. In Trigger Happy Havoc it was Junko Enoshima attempting to manipulate the trial's outcome in an effort to kill Kyoko Kirigiri. In Goodbye Despair it was Nagito Komaeda engineering his own murder case in an attempt to save the traitor. And in V3 it was Kokichi Oma and Kaito Momota attempting to sabotage the killing game with their unidentifiable victim setup. So the point is, there are certain tropes that every chapter in each of the 3 main games seeks to recreate. So what I'd like to see in a hypothetical future Danganronpa installment, therefore, is perhaps an effort to move away from some of these tropes, mainly for the sake of keeping things fresh and unpredictable. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying every trope needs to be dispensed with. I do think, for example, that Chapter 5 should typically always involve some major mind-melting plot twists and or revelations relating to the overarching story. After all, at that stage in any Danganronpa game, the player kind of expects it, I would say. But some of the other tropes could probably be changed, such as the double murder case in Chapter 3, or the killing off of the buff character in Chapter 4. These could either be moved to other chapters, or perhaps shelved altogether to make way for new possibilities. Wouldn't it be awesome if a buff character, for example, actually made it all the way to the end of a game for once? Or if a double murder case occurred a little later, giving its victims a bit more time for character growth before they're bumped off. So in short, the chapter tropes are definitely something I would like to see being shaken up in any hypothetical future Danganronpa game. Number 2. A religious character with a different arc. Now I want to discuss a more specific idea that I'd like to see in a future Danganronpa game. When I did my playthrough of V3 here on the channel, Anji Yonaga was a character who struck me as interesting quite quickly. She was the first and currently I think only instance of a Danganronpa character who is overtly religious and whose motivations are often heavily informed by her faith. So in this instance she frequently references her deity, Atua, whilst interactions and free time events often give flavours of a people's religious / spiritual practices. However, I do sometimes think there is a certain trope that it is all too easy to fall into when attempting to depict a religious character, and I think it's a trope that we definitely see with Angie. I think it's often quite easy to take a religious character and have them gradually turn into something of an antagonistic force. So what starts as a friendly, seemingly harmless eccentricity eventually gives way to reveal a character who is dogmatic, inflexible, manipulative and controlling. In short, somebody who deep down is actually quite cultish in their mindset and behaviour. This is a trope that V3 did go for with Angie. If you've played the game, you know that she starts out as this eccentric but friendly character, but by chapter 3 she has set herself up as the leader of the so-called student council and has exerted a creeping and somewhat sinister influence over several of her classmates, which results in tensions between those who follow her and those who do not. But as I said, I feel like this is a trope that's kind of easy to utilise. What I think would be interesting to see, if there was a future Danganronpa instalment, is to revisit the idea of a religious character trapped in a killing game, but to handle their character arc from a different angle. For instance, you could have a religious character who is genuinely kind, caring, modest, altruistic and pure-hearted. Somebody who genuinely believes in both the benevolence of their god, as well as the fundamental goodness of human beings. Wouldn't it be fascinating to then see how such a character would handle a situation like a killing game? Think of the possibilities here. You could have this character placed into a situation where their faith in God and humanity is tested to the absolute limits. This character could start out as resolute, trying to help their fellow students keep their morale high, but as more killings occur, they could gradually spiral into uncertainty and even despair, becoming increasingly depressed and withdrawn as they begin to question their own beliefs in divine benevolence and human goodness. Now that would be an interesting character arc in my eyes. In terms of how you'd conclude such a character arc, there are various possibilities. If you wanted a more optimistic conclusion, you could have that character survive, perhaps finding new faith not in some religious principle, but instead in the perseverance and well-being of their remaining friends. Or, if you wanted a more emotional and hard-hitting conclusion, you could have that character refuse to compromise on their fundamental values and just go out in an act of noble self-sacrifice. Or even if you really wanted something dark, you could have that character succumb to their own despair and decide that they just don't want to go on anymore, similarly to Ryo Mahoshi in V3. In short, a religious character offers loads of possibilities, and as such I think it would be interesting to see the concept revisited in any potential future Danganronpa game. Number 3. A historical setting. Now this is a big idea, and it's one that I personally think would be fascinating, though admittedly it would certainly also be challenging, as it would require careful and creative thinking in terms of how a killing game and its environment would function. So to explain, most of the Danganronpa games take place in what is essentially a reimagining of our current time, with elements of near-future technological possibilities such as AIs, advanced robotics, etc. The one possible exception to that, of course, is V3, which, depending on your interpretation, might take place in a much more distant futuristic setting. But for several months now, I've been thinking, what if you had a killing game that took place not in the present or in some future world, but instead in a previous time? How would a killing game be conducted in an earlier time period when technology was less advanced than it is now? How would it be constructed? Where would it take place? Who would its mascot be, and how would they function? How would the participants be kept under constant surveillance with the technology available at the time? What sort of executions would we see? What sort of ultimate students and talents would we have? Those questions are the reason why I think a historical setting would be fascinating. Though, admittedly, I do think there is probably a limit to how far back in time you could potentially set a killing game. Whilst Danganronpa does take some artistic liberty in terms of what is technologically possible, meaning you could have a bit of leeway in terms of how the killing game is set up and managed, you'd still have to keep things fairly believable for the chosen time period. So personally, I think the earliest time period you could feasibly go back to would be the late 19th century, probably somewhere between the 1870s and the 1890s, as this was a period that saw the invention of some of the basic technologies that I think an overseer/mastermind of a killing game could draw upon for surveillance. So things like phonographs for recording and reproducing sound, telephones for rapid communication, early forms of still and movie cameras for recording images, and advancements in electrical transmission and lighting. However, a more technologically viable time period, and one that I think might work even better, would be an early 20th century setting, perhaps in the region between the 1920s and the 1940s, because then you could bring in some other existent technologies such as radio control and communications, or you could even apply a bit of artistic liberty there, looking at what might have been technologically feasible around that time, even if in historical reality it wasn't actually developed until a little later. So for example, things like basic electrical computational machines, early thermographic cameras, or even the most rudimentary of video surveillance systems. For example, one of the earliest instances of live video surveillance technology that I could find in a quick Google search on the topic actually comes from Germany during World War II. So apparently the Germans in World War II actually used to use cameras for observation of V2 rocket missile launches, and whilst they couldn't actually record the footage, it was basically like a live feed. So like I said, with a little bit of artistic liberty, I think you could make certain historical settings work. So that's a series of ideas for some radically different temporal settings. This one kind of now leads me onto my fourth idea for something I think might be interesting to see in a future Danganronpa game, which is number 4, some ideas for new spatial settings. So technically what you're about to hear now isn't just one idea, it's 3, but all of these things I'm about to outline essentially revolve around the question of the physical setting, the environment where a killing game might take place. So I've decided to fuse the following ideas together under this one heading. Any Danganronpa killing game needs a variety of ingredients, and one of the big ones is a closed environment that is conducive to sowing discord and tensions amongst the characters, where there are no exits other than to play the game. So in Trigger Happy Havoc we have the barricaded Hope's Peak Academy itself with its unsettling hallways and its very oppressive atmosphere. In Goodbye Despair it was Jabberwock Island surrounded by ocean and, spoiler alert, which later turned out to be a virtual reality into which the cast had been trapped. In V3 we had the Ultimate Academy for Gifted Juveniles, which was surrounded by this huge, insurmountable outer wall. So what other kinds of closed environments could a Danganronpa game utilise? There are numerous possibilities, but here I'll go into the 3 ones that I personally find particularly appealing. So, setting A, an old castle in the mountains. If you watch my channel regularly, you'll know that I'm a big fan of the Wolfenstein franchise of games, and if you know anything about the Wolfenstein franchise, it's that one of the main settings in some of those games is Castle Wolfenstein, an old fortress in the German mountains, which is repurposed into a base by Nazi forces. And incidentally, Castle Wolfenstein itself is actually based on the Schloss Adler, which was the mountaintop castle in the 1968 war movie, Where Eagles Dare. So in both cases, these castles can only be accessed by cable car. Now imagine the possibilities of a setting like that. Taken over and repurposed by a mastermind, it would be the perfect paranoia-inducing environment for a killing game. The mastermind could coincide their game with the onset of winter, when the location becomes snowed in, making it impossible to leave, whilst the dark, narrow passages and halls could make for a very sinister ambience. Setting B, a ship adrift at sea. I'm a big fan of maritime and nautical settings, and that led me to another setting that would be ideal for a killing game, a cruise ship, or, if you went with my earlier idea about a more historical setting, perhaps an old-fashioned liner. I mean, look at how big both modern and even historic cruise liners actually are. You're talking about many decks worth of staterooms and cabins of varying qualities, plus diverse amenities for passengers, as well as quarters, engine rooms and the bridge where crew would normally be found. Imagine a situation where a cast of characters wakes up to find themselves trapped adrift on board a silent, spookily empty cruise liner with all the lifeboats, the engines and all communications gear out of action. That, in my opinion, would make for a great closed environment conducive to cabin fever and murder as well, because especially with the added stress of being at the mercy of the sea and knowing that the drifting ship could easily begin to flounder if it's hit by stormy weather. Setting C, an undersea facility. Kind of sticking with the maritime theme, instead of a ship on the surface of the ocean, you could go for something deep beneath the waves instead, with both the pressure of the surrounding abyss in the background, plus the stress of the killing game itself. It'd be another great recipe for paranoia and suspicion. I won't say much more on this one, as the exact reason as to how a typical cast of Danganronpa characters would end up in such a facility would have to be carefully thought out. Nonetheless, I still think an undersea facility of some kind would make for a great setting. Number 5. An English localization and release of Kirigiri-So for Western markets. For my 5th and final idea, I'd like to draw attention to one of the more obscure entries in the Danganronpa franchise. Now, I didn't know this existed until recently, but there is actually a spin-off visual novel found only in Japan, known as Kirigiri-So. Apparently, this game was packaged with one of the Japanese Blu-ray releases of the Danganronpa 3 anime. As such, there is no English localization of Kirigiri-So, as far as I'm aware. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think it was ever released to Western markets, though there are certain YouTubers who have translated it to English to the best of their ability. So from my knowledge, the storyline of Kirigiri-So is set just before the events of Trigger Happy Havoc. It follows a protagonist named Kohei, a student who encounters Kyoko Kirigiri whilst driving through a dark forest. After his car is damaged, Kohei has little choice but to accompany Kyoko on a detective job she's undertaking, namely an investigation of this strange, spooky Western-style mansion in the middle of the forest. Kirigiri-So has 3 alternate story routes that then unfold based on player choices made in the game. So, the first and canonical story route sees Kohei and Kyoko find out that the mansion is inhabited by strange, man-eating human-plant hybrid beasts, including one who is an exact doppelganger of Kyoko herself. Now, the other 2 non-canonical story routes are undoubtedly even weirder and wackier than the first. In one of them, Kohei and Kyoko find themselves having to fend off an invasion of alien lifeforms known as the Rhino Grodentia, whilst in the other route it's more of like a comedic route that features several bizarre shenanigans. But what is striking about Kirigiri-So is that it has much more of a dark horror vibe to it than the mainstream installments of the Danganronpa franchise, and I'm just going to say right now, I absolutely love the fact that in the canon lore of Danganronpa, Kyoko once found herself investigating a case involving actual human plant monstrosities created through some twisted scientific project. It's just a shame that Kirigiri-So has never seen a release onto Western markets, which is why I'm including it here in this video. If there's ever going to be a future Danganronpa game, why not simply take this existing installment and bring it to a much wider audience? My guess is that the devs at the time were worried it wouldn't sell very well outside of Japan, hence why it hasn't been, but hey, we can all dream. And that's it. Those are my 5 ideas for things I'd love to see in a future Danganronpa game. Let me know your own thoughts down in the comments. Was there anything here similar to what you'd like to see? Or is there anything you'd add to the things I've outlined here? I'd love to know. But other than that, it's time to wrap this video up, so I hope you enjoyed this little discussion, in which case please do leave a like, it's always appreciated. Other than that, you can find my Facebook and Twitter links down in the description, along with a link to my propagandist channel, and do of course, stay tuned here on this channel because I do want to do more Danganronpa content, especially discussion content, and maybe also some fan game playthroughs in the not too distant future. But other than that, I'm signing off now. Goodbye everybody. Oh, what the? What? This feels like we're actually being put into the game. What, are we having a chase scene right off the bat? Josie, over here! That's what he's going to call... That's going to be, oh, what the... Ooh! Okay, I don't know if we want to be near that. Are we just going downstairs? Oh, hello. I mean, it's an interesting form of chase sequence, but, okay, oh! Well, there's another one right there. I guess I'm going this way, am I? Jesus. Oh! Well, that's another one. Oh, well, you're over there now? Don't go that way, Josie. Over here. That's Shuichi's pet name for Kaide now. Oh. Well, yeah, that one's en route. Okay. Oh, I can sprint, can't I?